It's kind of going in reverse. To some degree, what it is about is developing like a discourse around the idea, and not just like, we wrote a thing, like here it is, but actually bringing it into a kind of collective of different people and trying to like take the language, the framework, and like work with people on, you know, test it against like other people's assumptions and ideas. So I think it's about these deeper formats. Like I don't like this idea of like you just make something, put it into the world, like move on, is less interesting than than like this discourse, deeper format where you're like really challenging like a particular idea.
Yeah. I think what's nice, I mean, it's interesting you say that, because I think that's somehow what I'm, anyway, sorry to now go back, but I mean, we're still maybe in the early part of the conversation. So that's also, in a way, what I'm also thinking and doing, but actually I never really put it in those terms.
For what? For
the conversation.
These conversations.
Yeah, the way in which I approach them. It's very much like careless. It does, you know, it's not. It doesn't really engage with the kind of the kind of attention span of a regular person. It's not trying to be catchy, or it's not trying to be anything.
Right.
Really, apart from just the conversation.
Right.
And so what are you? So what's your angle in the flesh out?
Crisis formalism.
Well, yeah, very very simply, we're basically looking at the formal implications of crisis. We have, I guess, it's a little bit undeniable right now in the world that the leading discourse across institutions is crisis in some form or another. So we have observed that, of course, as everyone has, but we've also observed a disconnect between architecture and these crises themselves. So basically the issue is just looking at, quite simply, like what the formal implications of crisis are. And that came through, we kind of categorized it. So in a way it is a survey of contemporary practice right now. We kind of categorized 4 different groupings of people, and we've kind of seen them as like a reaction to this contemporary condition. I think now, but that said, these people aren't necessarily cognizant of this. So our goal now is to approach it with more intention. And I think that is like one of the purposes of these like larger conversations, to kind of set forth a problem and say like, how am I going to solve this? And start to set up kind of real constraints and like how to proceed, basically.
And what's the kind of theoretical? Because this sounds to me a bit like an imaginary, a theory on imaginary, or these kind of scenarios, or.
Well, yeah. Let's. I think there's a big, within the framework, there's a big critique of the history of architecture's reaction to crisis, and how, since the second half of the 20th century, let's say, the emergence of technology, of like global interconnected systems, with it has developed the framework of like the polycrisis, which is like it is the problem of problems, that the kind of all the crises together interacting are more intense. And so the problem solving narrative of architecture, like dealing with something explicitly, like, oh, like we need to rebuild Tokyo, or like create a wall to stop flooding, or even like we're dealing with a crazy neoliberal economy, which ends up with something like Archizoom, or something. Like there's this reactionary quality to that we are critiquing through this framework, and it's kind of an idea of saying, rather than looking at a problem directly, architecture needs to kind of construct itself through the flows of crisis, rather than kind of looking at it directly and reflecting kind of a negative back to it. You know, it's the problem-solving narrative. And I think the basis, like one of the crisis formalism frameworks is like that form and crisis have kind of like disengaged from each other. And this is like an attempt to re-engage them, not through, you know, not through just, you know, through this new approach that doesn't deal with the problem directly. The problem that Michael's bringing up is not like how to deal with crisis. It's like how to deal, or it's not how to deal with a particular crisis. It's like how should architecture as a whole engage with the polycrisis as a body? Like what kind of reactions are appropriate? What is the formal way of dealing with all this outstanding work?
And does this relate to your practice in any way?
Yeah.
And how, I guess?
Yeah, I think
or has it emerged from your
it's
practice?
emerged basically. I think that through this effort we are trying to kind of pinpoint phenomenons and how to proceed. One theory that we're trying to explore as an implication of crisis is hollowness, which is something that happens already in architecture. But I think again it's about kind of proceeding with this sort of intention rather than just kind of a byproduct of what's happening in the world. So we're working on this house in Canada. It's like a recording studio in a house. And basically we're using that as one of the first examples of like really exploring this hollow building where everything is about the envelope. So, and everything is on the envelope, all structure, all mechanics, all thermodynamic properties, kind of everything. I would say it's
you mean in what encloses the
and but the building itself is basically a void. There's nothing inside of it, or if there is, it's very minimal and divorced from the actual architecture itself. So that's one way that we are doing it. I think the problem is that, like any theory, you can say that you're trying to solve everything, but in reality, we're attempting to solve a lot of different problems, but in reality, when it comes to these projects, you're still pinpointing like 5 things or something. You can't say I'm going to solve 1 million.
But I guess also, as an architect, you always are looking at the site. You're always looking at a very specific condition, situation.
Mm-hmm.
So, what is the appropriate problem to be solved?
No. I think one thing to answer that question is there is a set of, like, let's call them causalities. There's a set of causalities that have been appropriate for architects to react to. So take Rem's theory of Delirious New York or the Downtown Athletic Club, which is like 3 blocks away. So Rem set up a series of causalities of saying, like, this is how architects basically should proceed. Zoning code, programs, kind of this like urban form within a building. We're saying that's still relevant, but we're trying to add the crisis into that set of causalities. May that be like ecological causality or financial or geopolitical, a lot of different things, and those are all very big words. But
maybe I could challenge you now a little bit.
Sure.
Because I feel like maybe the crisis is something that's very immediate, and we are actually like kind of constantly. We're kind of going at fast. We're very fast pace. We're going from crisis to crisis. But architecture takes a long time to build. Like a building could take like 10 years to build. And so I really just want to maybe explore this overlay between the speed, the slowness of the profession in terms of like the speed at which,
Of course.
and then actually like the attempt to solve or like how do you address the crisis?
I think just Niall will go after me, but basically it's useful to set it up through, and we've spoken about this and wrote about it and all these things. One example is, it's a historical example that happened in the early 1900s in China. They're called the Kaiping Dailo Tower, and we are looking at them as an example of a lot of different forces that are relevant to today. So they are a result of kind of like mass deportation, or which is what you could call geopolitical crises. Basically, there's a certain area of people that were kind of encouraged to go to the Americas for the gold rush and to build the railroad. After that happened, they got kicked out in Canada and America, I think also Australia, due to something called the Chinese Exclusion Act. So then you had a mass kind of groupings of people that came back, and they built these towers in the field, and we're looking at them as a form of remittance housing. So they're at the top, they're very kind of like Western opulence that they're imitating. At the same time, were built at a time of a like unstable time in China, so like a warlord era. So they're quite literally watchtowers or castles. They're also in a monsoon territory, so there's flooding. Am I missing anything?
Probably no. I think that's the main.
Those are the main ones.
These are residential towers?
Yeah.
They're family homes.
There's basically family homes somewhere.
And then each community has like a central one for
Yeah.
like different families.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's an example.
Vertical communities.
Exactly.
Uh,
But I don't.
That's what they call them in China.
Right.
We were once in Nanjing, and they were telling us how they're going to remove all of these people from this vast area of Nanjing, and we're going to put them into vertical communities.
Oh yeah. I mean, these are like 6-story, max 5 stories tall.
Okay.
They're not skyscrapers.
It's 19th century.
Yeah.
Just to be
19th
clear.
century.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is
Yeah.
in the 1800s.
But basically, that's looking at 5 kind of distinct, what you could call crises, and saying that these towers emerged as a result of these crises.
Form,
Yeah.
which was the earlier point.
Exactly, but they're not yes, they are solving some things, and architecture will always need to solve some things, but they also are, they've become these symbols of a time. So that may answer your question in terms of like how slow architecture is. It's not that these things are still relevant to today's set of, you know.
It's like a case study.
Yeah, and
on a
also
crisis
and also
morphology.
the dream scenario is that this is that the world does not continue on this path of destruction. So hopefully we can change the project soon.
But I really want to like go back because there's a few things I'm really sensitive about after developing this. One is the idea of solutions-oriented work. Like I just think that is like a failure, like a dead project, partially because of what you're saying, which is like to solve something in this current environment is actually very directly playing into the crisis that it originally was meant to solve. So the polycrisis, insanely nefarious, webbed fingers, is able to very quickly absorb any solution into like an economic and capitalist framework. Like you very quickly go from like Kitsutake's Tokyo Bay project, radical floating cities, to like Bjarke Ingels like protecting Lower Manhattan in like the biggest infrastructure project, you know, in New York. Like, but I also think that part of the problem that's you're bringing up, this is very clever, and I don't think we have addressed clearly enough, is in Edgar Morin, who's coined the term polycrisis. Part of his big critique is that the polycrisis is out of chronological synchronization with its moment. So that basically no thing is happening now. You're actually stripped from like an immediacy. Like the immediacy of crisis that you brought up, I think is actually part of the myth that it creates to protect its like bigger body. Because the polycrisis basically started hundreds of years before us. It will continue hundreds of years after us. Our moment within it is basically destabilized by these poles. And we look at this other philosopher, Benjamin Ware, who writes on catastrophe and extinction. It's kind of like a end of the world philosopher kind of thing, but he has a kind of very important dilemma he brings up where it's like how to deal with a crisis is how to deal with catastrophe is acting as if it has already happened. Like his book is called Starting at the End. It's like basically saying like you need to like put yourself in two different like time scales to work on this kind of idea. One is as if the crisis happened, or as if extinction has already happened, and one is putting yourself in a place where you can still solve it. So it's like by combining, putting yourself across multiple time signatures or time positions, you can work in a better way, but it's a split mind, one that like only can happen under this insane kind of structures of crisis that are like literally like we're dealing with carbon output from the turn of the 20th century, which now we're trying to like build machines to extract from the atmosphere or something. Like that's like way out of our control, right? But those developments also gave us like the train, you know, the train tracks, which then sent the Chinese Exclusion Act, like, but also gave us like industry, and industry created coal, and coal like whatever. It's like this whole cycle that we're stuck in. But that's why this problem-solving thing, like in that sense, architecture is super fast against crisis in a way, because the crisis we're talking about is so long that actually it is responding quite rapidly potentially compared to that, but also not at all compared to what you're describing. So that's the kind of trickiest part of dealing with time.
You seem to be interdisciplinary in many ways. I mean, that's the sense I get. Mm-hmm. How would you assess other disciplines against this question? Like, is architecture faster than fashion?
Yeah, no.
I think that's a good question.
Because it'd be good if you said yes, that would be interesting. You know.
Architecture faster than fashion. I guess in a way, fashion.
In the context.
Yeah, maybe actually in this context, fashion has not really changed, has it?
Yeah, this is funny.
Or what does it do in relation to problem solving?
I think fashion's like it's so well. It's hard to say. Has a huge kind of material effect, but it's not really a part of its philosophy of construction, right? It's not like I was trying to say that. Fashion is. I kind of don't. I'm more interested in other disciplines.
Okay, let's speak about discipline.
No, you should talk about fashion.
Well, let's talk about fashion.
Fashion is the problem with fashion is that
maybe you can bring up this thing that you wrote about. We wrote this thing about the Prada Epicenter.
About the Prada what?
Epicenter in New York.
Like it's a good example. So we wrote this dual essay, which Reese was the editor for, who just walked in. But and I wrote a piece called High Speed, Long Lasting, which is exactly, I guess, the premise of your question.
Yes.
But the idea was like...
You're trying to skirt it, man.
I know, I'm trying to... the premise was that fashion often relies on architecture to appear stable. But its great skill, fashion that is being unstable. So what happens is, often fashion designers, especially in the last 50 years, have decided to make basically temples to their own in unstable and fickle practices, which are very important fashion practices as a aesthetic delivery system to help change kind of perspectives on formal versus informal, on gendered versus non-gendered, on conforming versus non-conforming. Like there's like all these abilities fashion has to like change the world, and yet there's so many stores who build, you know, whether it's concrete to Dao Ando or lots of examples. David Chipperfield for Fendi. You know, they build these monolithic.
Old Jotty and Celine.
Yeah, I mean,
Trying to keep him out of it.
That wasn't
But so they do that, and then what happens is literally, David Chipperfield designed like a $20 million Fendi store out of terrazzo, and literally 3 years later on Fifth Avenue, the terrazzo is painted white, and it's a Burberry store, and that's because, but that's to me is the great advent of fashion, is that it can move so quickly, and its supply chain is built that way now, which is even more interesting. Like,
it's actually the most concise machine in order to produce difference or something.
yeah, like relevant difference.
Yeah.
For people's kind of like aesthetic.
Because like when you look
agendas.
at these companies, they are metrically so precise, just in terms of all design and development and.
But they're just not. They're dealing with crisis in such a different way. That's what they're on. Like, you know, they're not. It's not like.
Not really.
And the question is, are we dealing with crises?
I think.
Or are we just?
Well, they could like.
I think dealing is. I mean, in a
Are we because you're against this notion of solving a problem.
Well, I'm not.
I'm not against it.
I'm not saying don't deal with it. I'm interested in like a type of work that develops from its logics, not like against it in a way, because to go against it, like you're only re-emphasizing its existence, like as and it feeds back in through another channel.
I think in general this stance is not so. It's not about binaries necessarily. It's not like against technological solutionism. It's like it's just not only technological solutionism. And that's maybe difficult because it becomes muddy, but also, we're trying to figure out how to deal with it. But I was thinking about like your question is interesting. I was thinking about it in terms of fashion's infrastructure for creative output versus development's infrastructure.
Like for architecture development.
Yes.
Yeah, because I think like development is similarly has metrics and supply chain, and it is in a way like an attempt to mitigate risk. Well, it's all about mitigating risk, which is why architecture has kind of come to a very banal existence in some form or another. Of course, the output of one building that costs $500 million is different than sweatshirt. That said, the sweatshirt is, you're still producing, spending a lot of capital on the production of it, but maybe it's just a scalar question. But the richest person in the world, top 5, is Bernard Arnault. It's not a real estate developer.
Well, it's
certainly,
actually a real estate
not
developer.
An architect.
It's certainly not architect. What?
He's actually a real estate developer. That's like where the majority of his money is in real estate.
That's not true. That's
well, didn't Prada just
That's my
purchase?
understanding.
That's your understanding, is the majority of Bernard Arnault's income is in real estate?
His value, his wealth. Yeah.
Really? Did you just make that up?
No, someone told me the other day.
I think Prada just purchased some building somewhere. I wonder whether it's in London. I think it's in London. I guess in fashion, the speed at which the output is produced makes the whole process a bit more integrated into the design process. I guess architecture, you may design a building, and then you may never be in control in how it's built or delivered.
It also has more banal uses to it. It's not like purpose built in that kind of way. But maybe we should talk about film, because I think film is dealing with a similar time scale to architecture, but doing something much more similar to fashion, right? And its kind of ability to coalesce a ton of different ideas and be complicated medium. Basically, you have music, performance, visual,
Acting,
narrative. So you have like a ton of different forms. And I know you're teaching on film, and I think that medium deals with the same creative problems as architecture.
I do
does
agree.
In many ways.
It's a very complex medium.
Yeah. But that's very tied into fashion in a way, because that's like also tied into the same. It has a similar type of cultural reception and output, which is like a film kind of like helps define cultural systems by opening new avenues into thought and like and types of interactions with other people. Like the way a film enters the world like actually affects how people interact with one another. I think in a way that's how it culturally relates. And architecture would dream of doing that. You know, like if Tony Fretton and Listen is like, oh, we can redirect, you know, how one views the city or whatever. That kind of, but that's a very phenomenological problem that I don't like.
I want to respond to this because one thing in one of our conversations that we had a couple weeks ago that we brought up, Alicia Turbe, her project is about what she calls carbon form. And basically, she speaks of it in a way that is like, you know, architects often say that, you know, like talk about difference and how little of a difference it makes, but then she is looking at particular moments in history, and not long ago, like the advent of Manhattan as we know it today in terms of like the current urban planning and therefore the architecture, which is a result of that, that ultimately changed the world as we, you know, it's not like that. These were implications and decisions that fundamentally changed the way everyone lives and thinks and talks and interacts. I know that's very like,
but not in a way. In a different way, I guess, in a much more behavioral way rather than because I guess film. I mean, we can have theorized film because it is different to fashion, but it's also different to architecture. But it's also similar. The subliminality or the kind of psychological component is extremely powerful, but it is different to the kind of psychological impact of fashion or architecture.
I don't know. I feel like the psychological impact of like Manhattan is so intense.
Well, it's definitely in a Freudian sense, much more kind of in your subconscious. Architecture is more like, that's what it's more like a set of foundation or subconscious, like the ground you live on. I think part of the importance of it is exactly that. And it's like, that's why architects are often drawn to like eternal or like really archetypal, like the word, archetypal solutions to say that, you know, this is like the baseline for which all kind of like aesthetic, interpersonal, economic invention must take place on.
Yeah.
So we end up with the gridirons of New York or something, or Ildefonso grid of Barcelona, or, you know, take your pick.
But that's interesting
all their
as like
reactions.
just purely a systematic or communal project.
Yeah.
Purely, it's not about, which is often like when the conversation goes towards like architects don't have any power, let's say, which is a fine conversation to have. That is to say that you are only thinking about yourself as an individual and not part of something that's like
collective.
Yeah,
or that someone else plopped you into. Like
sure, plopped
kind of
into, but how
designed
can you
into.
like just think like fundamentally changing the way that you think that you should operate is less about like but you know what I mean? Like I don't.
I mean, we're asking now, like, what is the medium of architecture, which is already hard enough. Film, also hard. You know, it's like, I think they're important because with the crisis formalism framework, we try to like open up the we do try to expand the ability for other mediums to intersect with architecture more explicitly, and that's why even the high-speed, long-lasting essay, in the end, it comes to the conclusion about the success of the Prada store is essentially this multiple time scale that happens there. You have the built store, and then you have the high-speed, designed to accept high-speed transfer of aesthetic invention. And so I think in our framework, it's like our obsession and even the interest in people like multimedia architects like Diller and Scafidio are like their very quick ability to kind of like coincide architectural frameworks like we're describing about the medium of the city or the block or whatever with the kind of other cultural actors that can map on, intersect, equivocate between two things, disintegrate, and evolve into something new. That's, I think, what we don't explicitly talk about also other mediums, but really that is part of the bigger idea. Because other mediums are like economy. Mm-hmm. That's like a medium that's very hard to like summarize. Maybe it's not.
I think it's interesting how we've actually, I think it goes back to your original point that you're actually interested in the form that these processes take. And so we've now kind of looked at a bit at fashion, a bit of film, and architecture. And in fact, I mean, as form is one thing, and on another hand, we have the kind of mobilization of, let's say, resources that are required to deliver this, and how maybe in film and architecture they operate in a similar way, whereas fashion is a little bit more kind of part of this loop that just never stops.
I guess it's become now a little bit more like, I guess with streaming or something, it's become a little bit more like fashion, where you do have like a certain type of infrastructure.
Correct. But to make, well, exactly, maybe the streaming and platforms and well, in certainly like Hollywood in its the studio era. Actually, the studio era Hollywood really operated like fashion because they were reusing props, they were reusing shots, they were making films literally like fashion's making clothes.
I mean, Niall and I have worked in film and fashion and architecture. So I guess it's relevant to talk about all of these things. No, this is like a side note. When our time in Hollywood, it's fascinating to see it as a kind of a family trade. Like we worked with basically like a scenic painter or matte painter who was like third generation or something, and then also like there's like these editors who are like third or fourth generation like Academy Award winning editors. And I don't even know, that was just like a total side note.
Okay, but actually my question was actually now going to take this to architectural education.
Sure.
So if we're able to kind of see how this operates in practice, but it sounds the way you're painting the picture of this, of this understanding, to me it sounds like architectural education is a great place where that maybe can be tested.
Yes.
Or these simulations run.
Yes.
How do you see? Is that how you?
I mean,
imagine
the people that have been joining
education should perform.
The people that have been joining these conversations are all purely academics, basically, and architects, but very influential in academics. Like someone like Scott Cohen was enormously, quite frankly, changed architectural pedagogy in America and Canada through a set of like analysis and formal studies, and we were very interested in his project because he does look at these, he kind of sets up these causalities, as I call it, to basically make these very strange and exceptional forms. So we were interested in talking to him to kind of try to set up the next generation of this. I think we were very interested in talking to these kind of geometers because they are so intentional with the form that they make. It is not so much like kind of playing in the sandbox or pushing things around on a digital screen. It has so much intention and is problem solving in a way that is, I know maybe I'm contradicting myself, but it's like,
that's what they're doing.
That's what they're doing.
We're trying to adapt that
I would like
process.
to adopt this thought process in the same manner. And I think that you need to, I think we need a way, we need a path forwards, which means that we need a curriculum in order to like figure that.
Curriculum or methodology?
Methodology, maybe.
Like,
Yeah, more methodology.
Sure.
I think this this theory is like for designers. Like I really believe this is like an architectural theory that it's for architects trying to make buildings, which I don't, and that comes out of Michael and I's probably too extreme interest in making buildings. Like that we are trying to design and make architecture. This theory develops directly out of our own interests in the problem of doing that, in making buildings relevant, and feeling that so much is irrelevant. And maybe beautiful or pretty or cool, but not like addressing the needs we have correctly. And so this theory is explicitly for people trying to design and construct buildings in a way that's like useful. So I think pedagogically, that is what it is, like absolutely. It's not that explicit, but I can see where it like comes from that.
No, and also mind you, this project started.
So by project you refer your practice.
No, this like conversation of crisis.
Conversation.
Yeah, it's less than a year old. So I think it's still very early stages, and I think the flash art issue we just did was more or less like kind of dipping our feet in and like interviewing people and prompting people to write and try to actually figure out how we can take the next steps, which we have not done yet. So I think as we do that, it will become more clear.
Yeah, and in the meantime, you see yourselves as architects?
Yes.
Yeah.
And nothing else?
No.
It's more that
I
we
do other
maybe
things.
believe architecture is an expanded practice a bit, but there's other stuff. I mean, Michael does a lot of,
I do a lot of things.
he's a painter.
Yeah, I paint and I do fashion, I do film, but I don't necessarily. I'm interested in keeping those separate.
Okay, so can we just kind of do that?
Sure.
That's kind of so housekeeping.
Sure.
Like a Venn diagram. Where,
Sure.
Okay, I think the kind of the crossover we kind of explored a little bit, but I'm interested in just you as a circle and you as a circle with another circle, or like maybe sometimes the intersection with another circle is a good way to kind of explain everything else. So
It's like the same diagram.
do you have this diagram?
Yeah, kind of.
Have you ever made
We've
it?
done it. Yeah. I think it's.
I'm so interested.
Well, we call it like architecture on the periphery of the discipline, basically, where you would look at a practice, say, like OMA, who is a good example of 21st century architect who operates this way, and that if you on the circle, OMA would be like on the edge there, but then in the center, you would have architects like Olgiati,
Birth and Displatzes.
like who are basically
Wrote the book on architecture.
who are singular, we would call potentially interested in kind of one thing. And I think that it's interesting now I use the word relevance. I don't know if I would use that word as well, but I do think that I am interested in architecture or painting or any of these things to be a reflection of its time. But that said, like someone like Olgiati, who is
Who probably also paints.
who is hyper conscious of this, of it,
Yeah.
of architecture being a reflection of the
Cultural.
time, of cultural.
Yeah.
I just think he does it wrong.
Can you can you explain?
So the diagram is basically one circle. At the center of it,
He
maybe,
wants us.
is
as
No, I want
architecture.
you.
He wants.
No, no,
us.
I'm saying,
He
I
wants-
think the diagram is more like one circle that's
He wants this
architecture
NGMA.
at the center. And then the question is like, and then all the disciplines are out on the other side of the circle. And that basically, the suggestion is how close are you to the center of that circle? And then it's
I
like,
understand that. No, I understand that.
No,
okay, you
he's
just
more-
need an introduction on what we do, basically.
Not really. Maybe. I'm interested in what, I couldn't really explain it very well, but basically I'm interested in both of these separate circles.
One is architecture, one is
No.
one is
I-
Nile, one is Maiocchi.
Yeah, exactly.
Where do we intersect? He's wondering.
It's not where
I have to say, a lot of people ask this, like, so what does Michael do and what do you do?
No.
I don't know.
Actually, I don't. I'm not
Okay.
interested in what you each do within your practice. I accept that the practice is this, but I'm interested in this and then that, and then what part of you is the practice, and then what part, like what. Do you understand my question?
I think I understand your question.
What do we share versus what do we...
Yeah,
don't share.
that's maybe a good way of articulating it. Maybe, okay, what do you not share?
Try to start a fight.
This is a good question because that basically means you're going to tell me
Because this is part
about
of your
all
new,
of that.
This is part of your new format.
Yeah, exactly. I'm developing my format. But what do you not share? What do you not have in common? Or like, where do you disagree?
I think a lot of what we don't have in common actually is this is the lemon,
Is the overlap.
is the lemon slice. No, for real. Because I think that a lot of things, Niall and I have spoken about this, where we are both sometimes like where is this coming from in a way, like neither of us would make this thing.
Yeah, that
Interesting.
that is true.
Yes,
It's like, but it doesn't feel like compromise. At one point it felt like compromise, and now it feels like something generative, where it's like, it's really about like us interacting and a kind of set of constantly reflecting each other's interests into like a project and trying to like mediate. It somehow develops into something that is really unpredictable. And that kind of non-linear style of design
But that is great. I mean, if you're able to overcome compromise and turn it into, again, generative.
It's very, I've never thought of it until now, but in essence, a large part of our project is about conflict.
I have literally, I thought about this.
Theoretically, it's about conflict and collision, and so this lemon slice is about conflict. So
Of course.
even
every interaction is. You could
But
also.
we have a creative interaction, which is reflected in this.
we actually don't agree on so many things.
And so the idea is essentially if we do both, like the theory literally is deriving, this is so funny you're saying this, it's true. The theory is deriving from the fact that we basically are going to do both, and now we have to theorize how to do two opposing views in one project.
Obviously that's not intentional.
No, it's not intentional, but it's funny because it's actually, early when we started working together, I was like, God, we should just do both things and then come what may.
No, but because most practices.
No, but that's.
A lot of partnerships are you have partners within a name, and each partner does something different, right? And then so you have Jason Long.
They have clearly defined roles.
Yeah, they have clearly defined
projects
roles.
or
Yes.
whatever.
And
Or
I think
projects,
we
yeah.
have thought about that at some points, and we have done projects like that as well. But I think our better work is within those conflicts.
Well, because the conflict is really a dialogue. It's a conversation.
Yeah. I mean, I
Maybe
think
conversation is a better way of.
yeah.
No,
I think conflict is
right.
I think conflict is
You think
perfect.
conflict is
Yes.
it's more conflict than a
Yes.
conversation.
Because I think the work has conflicts, unresolved conflicts in it.
No, but
Sometimes.
two examples even outside of architecture, like we write together as well. So the essay that he was speaking about, high speed, long lasting, we actually wrote our own. It is very short. We each wrote our own little body of text, but we didn't talk to each other or look at it. And then basically we sent it to the editor, and then they published it.
And the editor combined it.
No, we
No,
hadn't-
it's
we like
they
just
pu-
didn't know.
It's like a 8.5 by 11, like one side.
Oh, brilliant.
But now we also write together, like on a Google Doc. And it is fascinating to see how that plays out, because like we quite literally will have like fundamentally huge disagreements on what something is, which is maybe how the issue turned into a bit of a survey. But even we're writing an essay right now on hollowness, and which Nile conceived of these conversations of hollowness. And at the beginning, I was like against it, and I was totally not sold. And then I sat down for like a month and wrote, and then I was like, and now I'm like totally into it, probably more than him now.
Yeah, he was like, here it is, and I was like, who wrote this? Like this came out of nowhere. Like
But
a giant essay.
Was it an opposing view to his,
No.
or was it?
No,
Okay.
but I think it was maybe potentially a little more clear than his, but
Yeah, for sure. I mean, absolutely. That's why I was so like, I was like, this is way, took it a lot further. But that's part of the beauty of when we work, I think, together is like, you kind of can like raise the stakes on everything.
So how does collaboration work? Of course, you have other things that you do. So there's other things that you do. I guess
Yeah.
you still do them in this space or
Yeah.
in other spaces.
Yeah. I mean,
How are those lines drawn, or are they?
in my opinion, architecture is a very clear thing. It's not.
So calling it architecture, or
I'm calling it architecture.
it helps you define your relationship.
Well, I think architecture is like, yeah, sure, exactly. But I think architecture is, a building is the medium of an architecture.
Sorry, building is?
a building is the medium of architecture.
Yes. I think architecture, like this is architecture. It's not, I know people have made this distinction between like this is a building and this is architecture. I think you can just say that it's architecture. And then of course you have these theories of representation and things like that, which of course loop in. But if we're working on a building, we more often than not collaborate on it. But if I'm working on a painting, I just do it myself. Nile has nothing to do with it.
Can you just tell me a little bit about your painting?
Well, the paintings are very personal, basically. They're basically about myself, or some form of self-portraiture.
Yeah.
So I would say have nothing to do with architecture, even though maybe on the periphery it has my participation of that will, of course, like seeps into.
But formally, your paintings, I guess the style or the manner in which they're produced, are there any principles of that production that also?
I would say almost none.
Oh, right, that's
I feel
Maybe-
like your practice comes much more from painter practices.
Yeah, I'm like really obsessed with just like painters.
Yeah.
And I'm also very obsessed with architects. And I think to a fault, I have kept those separate to the point where like we basically don't have representation, which we kind of consciously did, where we're like, we don't want to make a project about like a cohesive representation, which I think we basically need to change this and start treating it more seriously. But yeah,
When you say representation, what do you mean?
like
Like not all none of our buildings get built. So we do have to make a type of representation that reflects our
Some do.
Ideas.
Some
ideas, yeah.
But we were fascinated by, Winston, we've been around for like around 5 years. So we've had projects built, but we also have projects that haven't, and some that will take another 10 years to build or 5 years or something. But I think,
But then representation is
well,
the project.
Well,
potentially the
well, like
medium.
if you look at a practice like MOS, it's of course very consciously using representation as like such a huge part of their practice. And Eisenman, it's kind of like an East Coast.
OMA in the early days as well.
Yes,
I
of
mean,
course.
Of course.
But I guess we were fascinated by architects like Lakatan Vassell, for example, who effectively we think it's like laughable how bad their representation is.
You mean like their website or something?
Just their pre-construction
Yeah.
representing, even if you look at a competition entry of theirs.
It's
And by the way,
so-
Sana is actually quite similar in a way, where you really like can understand what the building is. And Lakatan Vassell, it's like really crazy. You're like, wait, what? Like, it's screenshots or something. But what is the point you're
I was saying that there was like I was trying to separate,
that you need to bring in the representational practices of painting more so into our
probably.
practice.
Yeah.
I would hesitate a bit to say we have no representation. I mean, I know what Michael means. I think
But we made a conscious decision.
we made a conscious decision to make things not like some crisp rendering on everything
Like
we make.
Lutyens Padmanabhan, for example. I'm probably not saying their name correct, but
They make the same
have
scale
such a
model,
Same scale
1 to
model. It looks
50.
exactly the same.
Of course. Basically represent. Well, in some ways, they are painters.
Yeah, graphic artists. Maybe.
Right.
In some ways, they have a kind of.
Yeah. They have a very two-dimensional,
Well, like
graphic.
if you look at the work of Dogma, Pier Vittorio Aureli, like it's almost like a painterly practice. Renaissance painters would develop a painting by sketching a horse millions of times, and you would see all the studies before the painting is actually manifested.
Yeah.
But I think we have a different. Architects have a problem of there's a scale shift, right? So when you develop, you can paint the horse like almost 1-to-1 in a painting, right? And drawing is the medium, or painting a study is the same medium as versus architects have this scale. Architects have a very different problem than painting, which is you have a scale shift and you have a medium transposition, right? A material translation. So you have you're not working. We cannot physically make a building to study a building, but you can make a painting to study a painting, right? So that's why I think people debate is the medium of architecture a building, because that is the final result, and I agree with that as an important step, but it's the whole methodology of designing a building and figuring out what that is has to be constantly shifting into different scales, different visual languages, different technical materials. It's
Basic, yeah.
you're stuck in a, and then representation that we need to develop is one that reflects what we're trying to achieve in the final construction. That's to me very important.
But there's a difference between.
This goes back to what you said earlier, where you just said building is a medium.
Yeah, I think difference is a distinction is that you need other mediums to describe architecture, and you basically, and that is just a fact. May that be writing or painting or film or any of these things. But I still think that you can make architecture, which is potentially the designing of the building, but you still need another medium to represent it.
Well, I guess our job is to communicate the intent. Our job is to be intentional, or to communicate, or to be instructive I mean, in a sense, what you produce is a series of instructions. I mean, okay, like firstly you represent an idea, but then you produce a series of instructions for someone who is going to be made.
Yeah, I feel like that has just gotten out of hand in some form or another.
Yeah,
like the AIA or something. I don't know what happened along the lines.
I would rather try to build the building, as in not view it as this handoff moment of the instructions, but really
because
like
clearly that doesn't work.
take responsibility.
You it doesn't work. You have to be on site every day, basically like general contracting if you want it, because nobody actually reads your instructions anymore.
And it's all buried and hidden, and you can hide I don't know. It's a weird frame. Like I believe our job is to get a building built.
It's become a form of legality, which of course, like.
Of course, it's a contract documentation.
It's a contract, but I think disciplinary, in terms of the discipline, it's, I don't know. I think something shifted, and I think that is ultimately why in schools a lot of people aren't making architecture anymore, and then also in turn no longer. I mean, form and architecture to me are the.
But this is interesting because Olgiati is probably more likely to be on site every day than OMA.
And actually building the building.
No, I agree with that. We basically are obsessed with Swiss architects, I think, whether I want to admit it or not. But like but you look at someone.
Well, firstly, they live in Switzerland.
But you look at exactly. But so that's the problem.
You live like you're here.
No, yeah. I mean.
They're like practicing on meadows.
Exactly. I mean, but that's the thing. Like, so we can look at someone like Khoury, who we think is probably one of the best architects of our generation. But the thing that we think Khoury is missing is like a fundamental understanding of actually the world, or a certain mess, I guess.
And why are you obsessed with Swiss architects?
Because I think maybe to go with what you're saying, they are honed in on developing like a peer architecture practice. So I guess I would like to take that and then take this other side and like kind of go in the middle there.
Well, but maybe on a finer point on it is they are interested in architecture as a medium. And I actually think a lot of other climates of building don't think of it that way. They see all these legalities and representational practices and other things and don't really like, and then the building is kind of a resultant of other interests, theory, representation, drawing, whatever, language, syntax, all this shit. But they're very much more interested in like, what is a building in its real state?
Yeah, and then you have someone like Scott Cohen, who I would say is very similar, and more relevant to me, because he is hyper-focused on architecture, and his writing also, he talks about actual architectural ideas. Like, it's not so abstract. I think the earlier conversation we had about crisis has the major risk of becoming this abstraction, where you just don't know what to do with it. But the goal is to like break it down and be like, Scott Cohen talks about like the core and how he has this essay called The Hidden Core of Architecture, and how there's this certain set of architects that fundamentally alter the core of a building, and he kind of asks like what that does to architecture. And he uses examples like Khoury, he uses examples like OMA. I think OMA is hyper-architectural, actually, in terms of their detailing, whatever. That's another conversation. But I think Rem also was like, I don't know, he seemed insecure and wanted, and like hyper-focused on making buildings as well.
I think this point about Swiss architects, one thing that's interesting about it is that, and I would claim, or I would maybe say that there is a kind of architectural culture that operates in a certain way in that kind of part of the world. I've recently been looking into Irish architectural culture, which also can be defined as culture, because again, they practice in, they're a small cultural environment, and that allows them to develop, for better or for worse, a culture. You know, like they have one or two, one kind of central school of architecture, UCD, and then various, like recently, more smaller schools, and they really practice in this Canyon, Miesian tradition, kind of like if you combine Cannes and Mies maybe, because of some key figures that worked for Cannes, Mies, Venturi, then Scott Brown. I came to Ireland and then kind of articulated that culture through teaching mainly at UCD. And I was talking to Kenneth Frampton about this, and he was saying how, London doesn't have that. Of course, what he means is that it's a much more multipolar, plural place, and I think that's a good thing. But then I came to, in December, I was telling you earlier, I came to Boston and I went to see some of Kahn's buildings in New Haven and Exeter Library, and a few other things. And what was interesting during that visit was looking into maybe meeting some architects, interesting architects that operate in Boston or New Haven. There's major schools of architecture there, but I couldn't find any. And of course, like New York is an important place in this country for architecture. But I was wondering if you could describe to me American architectural culture, if there is such a thing. Where is it? What is it?
I think that, I know I'm answering quickly, but I've always imagined American architecture to embed substantially include technology into their practice and represent technology into their practice. I think you would even take a practice like MOS, who I think you're describing, I don't know, I feel like their work somehow, even though they're interested in kind of similar typologies, they're very interested in Venturi and Kahn, but somehow it's today they are still like obsessed with technology. I think that is one part of American architecture culture, for better or for worse, because you have that's also produced a lot of very bad things, which I think potentially seeped into the AA, or maybe vice versa. I don't know where it came from first.
What do you think?
I think it would be good to have a very good answer for this question, but it's interesting to say technology. I think of it more as like, first of all, it's like a crazy collision of different environments and different pools, because really the interaction of building something here between like Mexico, US, Canada.
Also, to call U.S.
Exactly.
one thing
how
like
geographically
because like LA,
can they
an LA
stay?
architect
Exactly.
is different than a New York architect. And
It's different to a Vermont architect.
and like a Vermont architect, it's like these environments are more.
Yeah.
A single state is more similar to Ireland.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So that's, and then
So you could say what is New York State architecture?
But there is but it's important, because what I'm saying is America was built thanks to the railroads and things connecting all these climates. So lots of stuff. Like I just did a project here using lumber from Oregon, right? So it's not, and everything is like that now. But America, in the kind of bigger sense of like this being the center of this kind of massive supply chain built around its success, the kind of entrepreneurial spirit of America is like very much like everything is kind of available in a way, like in this Hollywood notion as well of like kind of inventing any time and place. There's no like consistent city. There's no idea of like a material economy that develops a particular culture. Well, Boston might be brick, and New York was wood, and then brick, and then brownstone, and then steel, and glass and steel. But really the main factor is the kind of constant idea of economy driving all kind of decisions in the US. And in a good way, it's an entrepreneurial spirit to like build a lot of housing. Like Frank Gehry is like probably my most favorite example of an architect who from Canada is in LA, like builds buildings out of wood, you know, that, and then is like really from 1950 when he starts his work basically up until now, he's kind of like building very clearly within the means of production in the most like economic kind of like trajectory of being like making houses out of wood studs, out of steel fabrication. Technology becomes super important to his practice in the 90s. Like he's very directly relating to like whatever is like the momentary kind of economy, which is then becomes what in an Italian city would be like the morphology of the city. Ours is like the economy of the continent.
But it's also easy to, we are all products of our environment. And so it's easier to talk about New York City because New York's, it's not as if our lineage is it's not different than a lot of other New York architects. It's a lot of New York architects in general have been obsessed with a sort of like multiplicity. And so in a way we are like a regional architect in a similar way as an Irish architect in the prairies or something. I don't think.
I mean, again, also the reason why Irish architectural culture is kind of brick and concrete is because of the availability of those materials in that.
But you know, the downfalls of New York City are, you know, will produce some fascinating results as well. Mm-hmm. But increasingly, New York architecture the culture is extremely interior.
It's built. Most of it's built.
Most of it's built already.
So development happens within the bodies of like existing.
And then any architecture that is built, it happens two ways. One through a developer, and it's going to take the least amount of risk and spend the least amount of money possible. And the other version is you can get a building through the DDC, which is the government, and you have to hit a certain set of requirements and also probably lose money while designing that building, and it just becomes more of a bureaucratic practice. So this, in turn, a lot of American architecture, particularly in New York, results in like young practices building, let's say, interiors or projects outside of New York or houses in upstate New York or something.
Mm-hmm. And so what is
Sagaponic critical regionalists.
Exactly.
And what does this do to discourse? Because again, if the let's say architecture schools in America, usually school is in some way it's a epicenter of discourse.
It's fragmented for sure, and I even think part of our introduction. Yeah, like there's like discourse isn't really centered on a particular schools. Like obviously if you're in the school, you're within the discourse of the school, but I think lots of people are getting information from other schools, interacting with other institutions. Like people who go to GSD know what's happening next week at ETH or AA. Like it's exciting, but it's also showing certain weaknesses in the kind of institutional. And these conversations we've been having have been across the board to the people who attend very much like not something happening. A 6, 7, 8 hour discussion about a single topic is not something happening every day at a school. And you think that should be actually what is happening. And these deep formats are necessary to develop discourse, because otherwise everything's Instagram architecture or Instagram theory, like producing just another book to kind of like throw into the world. And I think like without these deep formats and centers of discourse that actually try to like challenge, develop ideas, it's much more American in the sense it's every person for themselves, and like it's kind of this, what is your like reach in selling an idea, like even if it's not having like real true impact on discourse.
I'm just realizing it's a question for you that speaking to people from New York, they seem to be a lot more crisis oriented than, to use your term, than let's say people in Boston or New Haven. I was at a crit at Harvard in December, and the person that was there from Columbia was kind of shocked that none of the students were discussing or addressing any world issues like Israel and Palestine or any, Trump being elected, and none of that was in any of those Harvard projects. And it's like, oh my God, which reality do you live in?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Awareness or I don't know how.
I'm sure they're aware too, but
no, but they're aware. But also, those two schools that you mentioned, like, I think both of them are doing something equally important. But you just need to.
you have to bridge it.
You have to bridge it, and you can't have one without. I don't think you should have one without the other.
Because I think the Columbia students, where I went and taught, and still frequently go, like, they are extremely politically charged, to the extent that they, it's a crazy practice going on there the last couple of years. But what's interesting is, like, the work, suddenly, like, the whole thing is a performance of their theory or of their activism, and not that the building is it's harder to understand the building as something that's performing that work. Whereas Harvard is, like, dealing or someone explicitly dealing with architecture in the way that feels negative is dealing with what is the potential of the medium of architecture. And so then it's like you're trying to, like, bring those together.
And where are you in that landscape? Where do you
we believe we would like architecture to be a political actor.
We're trying to be in the lemon slice, the Venn diagram.
It's simple. Architecture should be a political actor, not architects necessarily. Right? It's not like necessarily the work we make should be the thing that is highly relevant to this conversation as much as our participation in.
And should architecture be self-referential? Should it be cater for activism or?
Those are two different questions.
I think activism is, like, a bit of a word like fashion, where it's has a really particular time scale associated with it, which I think makes it so powerful.
What do you mean by that?
I'm saying activism relates to, like, a very particular moment.
Like
often.
responding.
And you could be,
sure.
So it has a time scale where it's really, like, it's really sharp, where architecture and activism go together the same way architecture and fashion might, which is, like, they're dealing with problems of time differentials. So you need to build a framework that supports activism if you're interested in that.
I mean, a lot of these problems have been going on for.
Yes,
well, it goes back to your
certainly,
earlier
like,
point.
intractable problems.
Like,
I mean, it goes back to your earlier point about crisis as something that is
it's not
less immediate,
people have
but more.
entire practices based on studying Palestine and architecture. I think the event of activism is one thing, or the kind of, like, catching wind of it. That's one thing, but I wouldn't.
Yeah, you should be a political architect. One of the main conceits for me on working is to make architecture that has political agency.
But architecture will always be political.
But not but not in a complacent way. It's political in that, like, if you build the status quo, it's like you're complacent in a kind of structure of carbon and inequality that you adopt. But what I mean by architecture being political is both literally in a material and economic sense, and also representationally in, like.
But architecture also has clients. And
and you need to.
What is so much of the kind of political. All other forms of awareness.
That's true, but buildings don't have clients. That's, again, like, that's. But I just mean to say, like, there's agency in every project. Like, there's not. I don't think.
But so much of that agency sits with the source of the capital that's required to build a building.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, that's true.
100%, yeah.
But it's not. That's like
It's
a
just
way of.
another thing, though.
avoiding.
It's like the site or something. And then if you make your project entirely about a client, then you'll more likely than not make bad architecture.
And same thing with a site. If you make a project just about a site, you might as well just.
So how do you negotiate?
You need. I mean, I think you build teams that reflect your ideas. I don't think clients are obsessed with money in the way that people act like. You know, that's not what's happening. Like nobody builds a building because no one comes to like an architecture and wants like a beautiful design just as some sort of. I mean, lots of people do, but do it just for the economics of like good design being like something of value. But I think like you need to build if you're an owner of a building in a community, it needs to be like you kind of have like a lot at stake. So I do think you need to find the right teams to like kind of make this happen in the way you need to.
We did talk a little bit. We did talk about
Or you do it yourself.
painterly practice, but I'm wondering about your kind of practice now, where you edit and edit.
Yeah,
together as well,
we do a lot
so.
of the same.
Yeah.
It's the same together, but I think writing is just very well. First of all, it's more about interviewing people and editing with other people. So it's bringing in people I don't know to write on issues I'm interested in. And in terms of talking with architects, something Michael and I both have done. Before we ever worked together, we conducted interviews. It's both a way of like being in touch with people you respect or understand in a special way, but also it feeds into your knowledge of like how to be how to be an architect, like, which is a big challenge. And a lot of the interviews I've done recently are like with people that are kind of at the end of their careers, like 70s, 80s. And they just have and every time these ideas come up of the political problem, like they're all very sympathetic, but are like long past the point of needing to deal with that, or because they have their own.
And they've also seen cycles.
And they've seen it all. And Dealers Video, which we interviewed, was last year together. They were one of the ones who really kind of understood it, but still, they've gone, they have their own kind of style of working now within this huge economy globally, like government projects, like very established at this point.
Mind you, one of the best examples.
Great example, but it shows it's.
I think very good.
It's an example of. It's also a funny example of how even one of the most. I mean, to everyone's surprise, they've done this, despite being a art practice, doing stuff that's still inscrutably complex. Where you're like, there's no like simple absorption of what they were doing into the world. It's not obvious that a museum would be like, yeah, now like do this weird art project like for $700 million. But lo and behold, they've kind of found a way to like maintain this weird, complex, illegible kind of language and develop it into huge scales. So that's exciting. I mean, that's nice, but I don't view that as like. I mean, I view all these things as interesting and useful to practice, but that's just like being in love with architecture and like trying to